turns out that answer's wrong. Why is the answer wrong? It's wrong because it's vague. And this kind of thing happens all the time in philosophy. You think you understand something because you've got a pretty good idea of how you use a word in everyday life, and then you're talking to someone and you have a disagreement. And then you realize later on that the reason you've disagreed is that you didn't define all of your terms. So when we're talking about freedom, or anything else really, you have to define all your terms at the beginning, and if you come to a disagreement, one of the first things you have to consider is that the other person, you're talking across each other, and the other person doesn't share the definition with you. So what's the problem in this case? Well, here's the definition of freedom that I presented earlier. Freedom is proportional to the things you can do. Well, we have a term here, you, and that looks like it's a constant in this definition. But actually, you is a variable. So, because the definition doesn't say who you applies to, different people look at this definition and they think it means different things. In the BSD license, as it turns out, you applies to one group of people, and in GPL, you applies to another group of people. So, and if there's no agreement on this, if people don't say with respect to whom we're defining freedom, then we're just talking across each other. Now, I mean, you know, political philosophers have been around for a long time. We've come across this problem before. And here's what Jared McCallum, another political philosopher, had to say about this problem. So McCallum said, in order to define freedom, in order to talk about freedom in an interesting, in a relevant way, you have to say three things. You have to express your definition in the form X is free from Y to do Z, where X ranges over agents, Y ranges over preventing conditions, and Z ranges over actions. So this is referred to as the tripartite definition of freedom, or tripartite freedom. As it turns out, the BSD and the GPL pretty much agree on what Y and Z are. In general, the conditions that you want to be free from are the things that are imposed by default by normal copyright laws, and the freedom, the sort of freedoms you want to have, the actions you want to be able to do, are things like using and distributing and modifying the software. But what they don't agree on is X. They don't agree on who the agent is. The GPL and the BSD disagree on who the subject of freedom is, to whom freedom applies. Under the BSD, which says something like this, freedom is for redistributors. And under the GPL, which says something like this, freedom is for all users. So in this case, what does copyleft do to freedom? Now we've realized that we have slightly different definitions. Well, it seems like it's something like this. Redistributors look like they're a subset of all users. So it seems like the GPL, which is concerned with the freedom of all users, is better, guarantees more freedom, because you're guaranteeing freedom for a larger group of people. So we're being less selfish, I suppose, if we're trying to get freedom for as many people as possible. If we're trying to get freedom for all users under the GPL versus just redistributors under the BSD. So the first time round, we thought that copyleft made us less free, but now it seems that copyleft makes us more free because there's more freedom for more people. As it turns out, this answer is wrong as well. We still haven't thought about it enough, still haven't talked about it enough. Why is this answer wrong? Well, political philosophy has been here before as well. And this time it's in the work of a man named Isaiah Berlin, who talked about, in a famous paper, amongst other things, there being different types of freedom. And Berlin says that there are two conceptions of freedom that are different and irreconcilable. They're entirely separate. They mean things that are so diverse that you can't bring them into agreement. He says there are two types of freedom, then positive and negative freedom. And the way that he defines them, positive freedom is a sort of freedom that applies to groups, like all users or the community. And negative freedom is a sort of freedom that applies to individuals. So why does this matter? Well, the crucial difference between the GPL and the BSD is that under the BSD, the term redistributors applies to individuals considered individually. But under the GPL, all users is a collective group. So, under the BSD, we care about the freedom of you, and the freedom of you, and the freedom of you, and the freedom of you. But under the GPL, we care about the freedom of all of you, taken together. And in this case, because the way that we conceptualize a group, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And here's the problem. The GPL uses positive freedom. Copyleft is positive freedom. The GPL cares about the freedom of groups. Copyleft cares about the freedom of groups. So far, you've only got my word for it that this is actually a problem. I haven't said anything about what negative and positive freedom actually are. I haven't told you why you should prefer one over the other. You might be thinking, but I like groups. I like living in a group, so perhaps I would prefer the freedom of groups to the freedom of individuals. Well, Berlin disagrees with you. And to show you why positive freedom, the freedom of groups, is a problem, I've come up with an example of another software license. And this is one that luckily doesn't actually exist. This is a general slavery license. Under the GSL, each user is required to contribute 4,000 lines of code or 500 man-hours, whichever is the greatest, to maintaining, updating, or improving the software. Obviously, the license is a lot longer than this, but that's just an extract. So it's a ridiculous idea, of course, right? Yeah. But still, let's go with the thought experiment. Let's think about what the consequences for freedom are of having this license. So such a license would actually make your software much better, if you think about it, because everyone who uses it is forced to contribute in some way. And because the software is better, there are more things you can do with it. And because there are more things you can do with it, you're more free. So forcing all your users into slavery would actually make them more free. I'm not sure it would be adopted by the OSI, though. So the general slavery license actually increases the freedom of the group, of the community, of users of the software. The GSL improves positive freedom. It makes the group more free. But obviously, this doesn't benefit any particular individual. Individuals under this are made less free. So negative freedom is impacted negatively, is decreased by the GSL. So because we've got these two different conceptions, well, almost conceptions of freedom, we've got different things happening to freedom at the same time. Now, this is an extreme example, of course, but in political philosophy terms, in thought experiment terms, the only difference between this and the GPL is the nature of the restriction imposed. There's still a restriction under the GPL. It's just less extreme. Instead of forced labor, you've got sort of prevention from doing specific things. The GPL and the GSL are of different amplitude, but they're the same type of idea. And this comes about because positive freedom doesn't care about the extent of restrictions. In fact, positive freedom doesn't care about how much freedom there is. Positive freedom only cares about where the restrictions come from. So to be positively free, you have to do to be positively free, the restrictions have to come from the group or the community, not from someone outside. If the restrictions are to a certain extent self-imposed, by the group at least, then that makes you more free, regardless of how much stuff you can actually do. So positive freedom goes against negative freedom. They're diametrically opposed. This probably still hasn't made the case for some of you. I'd like to have my code updated and improved forcibly by everyone who uses it. But this is still something to worry about, and it's something that Berlin worried about. In fact, Isaiah Berlin had two arguments against positive freedom. So this touches on the first argument. What he said was, positive freedom, the problem with positive freedom, the freedom of groups, is that it can lead to things like the general slavery license. And the way he put it was, the rationalist argument has led by steps which, if not logically valid, are historically and psychologically intelligible, from an ethical doctrine of individual responsibility and individual self-perfection to an authoritarian state, obedient to the directives of an elite of Platonic guardians. In other words, positive freedom isn't really freedom at all. It's just tyranny by another name. So you might get to choose your tyrant, but I don't think anyone really thinks, at least Berlin didn't think that anyone really thinks, that a group is made more free just because their leader, or the conditions that are imposed upon them if they don't have a leader, come from within the group. You can't make a group of people more free by forcing them to do the right thing. So Berlin's second argument against positive freedom is it's more convincing, I think. I think it's a better argument because people obviously do adhere to positive freedom. But so this one doesn't put positive freedom in opposition with negative freedom. It just says on its own terms why negative freedom is better. So if we were using positive freedom, every person who we were thinking about would be able to claim that certain types of restrictions should be imposed for the benefit of the group. Different people have got different aims, so they'd ask for different restrictions. So academics would ask for educational restrictions which benefit education, companies would ask for commercial benefits, and the military would ask for defense benefits. But not all of these goals are compatible, because different people not only want different things, but they want things that can't all be granted at the same time. So positive freedom can't work if in your group different people have got different goals. If in your group everyone thinks the same way, then positive freedom can work, but as it turns out, that's not very often the case. So Berlin suggests that rather than imposing all these different individual restrictions to get everyone what they want, rather than choosing positive freedom with lots of different goals and lots of different restrictions, what we should do is say, well, everyone has negative freedom, and choose your own goals, and then you can work towards them. And if you can convince people to work with you, fine, but we're not going to let you impose restrictions because that's counterproductive, and it wouldn't work anyway. The way Berlin puts it is he says that there's no a priori reason to believe that there is a final solution in which all positive values are important. The ends of men may not be reconcilable, so freedom to choose through pluralism of values, and hence negative freedom, is the truer ideal. So positive freedom, and the second argument is essentially, positive freedom works, yes, but it only works for authoritarian groups where there's a single goal. So here's the third take on copyleft. Freedom can only acceptably be defined as a property of individuals. not a property of groups.